On the west side of Cleveland, where Franklin Boulevard curves through what was once the city's most prestigious neighborhood, there stands a mansion that looks like it was pulled from the darkest corner of a fairy tale. 4 stories of rock-faced sandstone rise toward gray skies. A round tower climbs from one corner, its windows staring out like hollow eyes. Turrets pierce the roofline. Gargoyles crouch along the eaves. This is Franklin Castle, and it is considered one of the most haunted houses in the United States. Between 1881 and 1895, 6 members of the Tiedemann family died within these walls: a 15-year-old daughter, an elderly mother, 3 more children, and finally, a wife, Louise Tiedemann, who succumbed to liver disease after watching her family slowly disappear. 14 years, 6 deaths, 1 house. But the documented tragedies were only the beginning. For more than a century, darker rumors have clung to the mansion. Whispers of murder, legends of a niece hanged from the attic rafters, stories of a mistress strangled in the tower room. And in 1975, workers discovered human bones sealed inside a hidden wall panel. Bones roughly 100 years old, bones never identified. In the 1960s, the Romano family fled the house in terror after encountering a crying girl in white, hearing phantom organ music, and receiving a priest's warning: leave. This house is getting the best of you. In the 1980s, residents reported being pushed downstairs and hearing babies crying from inside the walls. Was Franklin Castle simply cursed by terrible luck? Or did something far darker unfold behind those sandstone walls? The answer lies in the story of Hannes Tiedemann, a German immigrant who seemed to have achieved the American dream, and whose dream became a nightmare that refuses to die. If you enjoy uncovering the darker histories hidden behind grand estates, you're welcome to subscribe and explore more with me. The story of Franklin Castle begins not with death, but with hope. It begins with a young man standing on the deck of a ship, watching the coastline of America emerge from the Atlantic mist. The year was sometime in the mid-1800s. The man's name was Hannes Tiedemann, born on the island of Rügen in the Baltic Sea in 1832, in what was then Prussia. Hannes arrived in America the way millions of immigrants did, with little money, no connections, and a willingness to work until his hands bled if that was what success required. But unlike many who came seeking only survival, Hannes brought ambition and knowledge. He had studied engineering and business back in Prussia, understanding systems and numbers in ways that would serve him well in a country being built on both. He settled in Cleveland, a city exploding with opportunity during the Gilded Age. The Great Lakes provided transportation. The railroads were spreading across the continent. Fortunes were being made in steel, oil, shipping, and manufacturing. Men with vision could rise faster here than almost anywhere else. Hannes started in wholesale groceries, learning the fundamentals of commerce. By 1864, he had become a partner in the firm of Wiedemann and Tiedemann. The business thrived. His reputation grew not only for business acumen, but for fairness. He paid decent wages, honored contracts, contributed to German cultural organizations, and helped newly arrived immigrants find their footing in America. Somewhere during these years, Hannes met Louise. The historical record is quiet on the details of their courtship, but the marriage that followed would become the center of his life. Together, they started a family. Children arrived: Emma, August, Dora, and others whose names would later be carved into cemetery stone. But Hannes was not content to remain a grocer forever. He understood that real wealth came not from selling goods, but from controlling capital. In 1883, he co-founded the Savings and Trust Company, one of the first institutions organized in Ohio under new laws permitting the formation of trust companies. As founder and vice president, Hannes was now handling the money of the city's wealthiest families. He had climbed from immigrant to elite in less than 2 decades. By the late 1870s, Hannes Tiedemann was genuinely wealthy. And in Gilded Age America, wealth demanded visible proof. Franklin Boulevard, on the city's west side, was becoming the German-American equivalent of Euclid Avenue's famous Millionaires' Row. It was quieter than the East Side mansions, but no less prestigious among Hannes's fellow German immigrants who had also succeeded in America. The decision to build was not simply about having a larger house. The Tiedemanns already owned property on Franklin Boulevard. They had lived at the address since 1866. But Hannes wanted more than a residence. He wanted a statement, a house that would demonstrate beyond question that a boy from Rügen could rise to the heights of American society. He wanted, in short, to build a castle. Hannes hired Kudell and Richardson, the most prestigious architectural firm in Cleveland. He drew up plans for a 4-story mansion built from rock-faced sandstone with a distinctive round corner tower. The style would be high Victorian eclectic, blending Queen Anne elements with German Gothic influences. Construction began in 1881. Workers swarmed the property. Masons laid the foundation. Carpenters framed the interior. The castle, for it was already being called that by neighbors, rose steadily toward the Cleveland sky. Hannes walked the construction site with Louise, pointing out where rooms would be, where their children would sleep and play and grow. This house would be their monument, their legacy, the place where the Tiedemann name would be established for generations. Everything was going according to plan. What none of them could know as they watched the walls rise and the tower take shape was that this beautiful house would become associated not with triumph, but with tragedy. The darkness was already waiting. When Hannes Tiedemann decided to build his castle, he went to the best. Kudell and Richardson had shaped Cleveland's skyline throughout the 1870s and early 80s, their name carved in stone on some of the city's most impressive buildings. The lead partner, Frank Kudell, was himself a German immigrant. Born in 1844, he had arrived in America as a young man and worked his way up through Cleveland's architectural circles with the same determination that Hannes had shown in business. They understood each other. Kudell and Richardson had built their reputation on grand churches, including St. Stephen Roman Catholic Church, with its soaring spires, and Franklin Circle Christian Church, with meticulous craftsmanship, buildings designed to last centuries. When Hannes approached the firm about designing his home, he wanted a mansion that would rival anything on Euclid Avenue. He wanted a building that would announce, without words, that the Tiedemann family had arrived. The Kudell delivered. The design was high Victorian eclectic, exactly contemporary with the most advanced architectural developments in Chicago and New York. It blended Queen Anne elements, asymmetry, varied textures, decorative details, with Gothic influences that recalled the castles of Europe. A round corner tower would rise from one edge, topped with a conical roof visible from blocks away. The scale was breathtaking. 4 stories tall. 20 rooms, though some sources claim as many as 28. Approximately 80 windows punctured the walls, flooding the interior with natural light while creating an exterior facade that seemed to watch the street, the neighborhood, Cleveland itself. But the design was not merely about grandeur. Hannes had specific requirements. Yes, the house needed formal spaces for entertaining Cleveland's business elite, but it also needed to function as temporary housing for newly arrived German immigrants. Certain rooms could be closed off to create private quarters. The layout allowed parts of the house to operate independently. Hannes remembered what it felt like to be a stranger in America, and he would make sure others did not have to struggle as he had. The construction moved forward through 1881 and into 1882. Masons worked in all weather, laying course after course of sandstone. The round tower took shape, its curves requiring exceptional skill. Carpenters framed the interior, creating rooms within rooms, staircases that climbed through multiple floors. Decorative details appeared as the work progressed. Carved stone ornaments around, windows and doorways, the distinctive brick red trim that would frame every window, creating visual contrast against the gray stone. And along the roofline, gargoyles, grotesque figures meant to be protective guardians, but that would later take on more sinister associations. Even today, after more than a century of weather and wear, fires and neglect, Franklin Castle still commands attention. Passers-by stop to stare. The building has a presence, a weight, a sense that it matters in ways ordinary houses do not. In 1881, or possibly 1883, as sources disagree, the Tiedemann family moved in. Hannes and Louise walked through rooms that still smelled of fresh plaster and new wood. Their children ran up staircases, their footsteps echoing through empty halls. Furniture was arranged, curtains were hung, gaslights were lit in every room. This was the moment of triumph. Everything Hannes had worked for was now solid and real. The castle stood. The family was together. The future stretched ahead, bright with possibility. They were ready to fill this grand house with life and laughter. They could not know how short that chapter would be. January 1881. Construction workers were still hammering, still laying stone. The house was not yet finished. Rooms remained unplastered. Staircases awaited railings. Windows stood empty, waiting for glass. And 15-year-old Emma Tiedemann was dying. The disease was diabetes. In 1881, that diagnosis was a death sentence. There was no insulin, no treatment beyond prayer, and the slim hope that the body might somehow heal itself. It never did. Emma was on the edge of adulthood, old enough to understand what was happening to her. She had watched her father's business grow. She had seen the plans for the magnificent house being built. Instead, she grew weaker. Her body consumed itself, unable to process the sugar in her blood. She wasted away despite eating. Exhaustion pulled at her until even sitting upright became difficult. Emma died in January of 1881, before the family even moved into Franklin Castle. She never slept a single night in the house her father was building. This detail would later become important. If Emma died before the house was complete, then the crying girl in white that residents would report seeing decades later could not be Emma's ghost, bound to a house she never truly lived in. The legend and the timeline do not match, but legends rarely care about timelines. For Hannes and Louise, the facts were brutal and simple. Their daughter was dead, at 15, just as everything they had worked for was coming together. Just as the magnificent house, the symbol of their success, was taking its final form. Hannes and Louise buried Emma. They stood beside a grave that should not have needed to exist for decades. They returned to a house that was supposed to represent joy and triumph, and found it now shadowed by sorrow. Grief had entered the walls from the very beginning, mixed into the mortar, woven into the wood. Franklin Castle had been marked by death before it was even finished. The construction continued. More stone was laid. More rooms were completed. The round tower reached its full height. The windows were fitted with glass. The gargoyles were mounted along the roofline. Slowly, steadily, Franklin Castle took its final form. The family settled in. August and Dora, the surviving children, adjusted to their new home. Hannes went to his office. Louise managed the household. Perhaps there were moments of happiness. Perhaps there were evenings when music filled the halls, or mornings when sunlight streamed through those 80 windows and the house felt warm and alive. But Emma's absence was permanent. Her place at the table stayed vacant. Every birthday that passed without her, every Christmas, every ordinary Tuesday afternoon, reminded Hannes and Louise that their daughter was gone. The family tried to move forward. They had no choice. But the shadow of Emma's death lingered in every hallway, waited in every empty room, and whispered a question that no one wanted to ask aloud. Was this only the beginning? Emma's death was not the end. It was the beginning. Shortly after burying his daughter, Hannes lost his mother. Vibeke Tiedemann, who had crossed the ocean from Prussia with hopes of seeing her son's success in America, died in the house on Franklin Boulevard. She was elderly, and her death was expected, but the timing felt cruel. 2 funerals in quick succession, 2 graves in Riverside Cemetery, 2 absences in a house that had been meant for celebration. Hannes and Louise buried Vibeke beside Emma. They returned to Franklin Castle and tried once more to resume normal life. But death was not finished with the Tiedemann family. Between 1886 and 1888, 3 more children died. 3. In the span of just 2 years, their names would join Emma's and Wibeke's on the family monument at Riverside Cemetery, a stone marker that would eventually bear so many names, so many dates cut short, that visitors to the cemetery still stop to stare at it, trying to comprehend the scope of loss one family endured. The medical context is important. This was the 1880s, an era when childhood death was tragically common. Measles, diphtheria, typhus, whooping cough, scarlet fever, pneumonia, dozens of diseases that are now preventable were then simply facts of life. Every parent understood that not all children survived to adulthood, but even accounting for the era's brutal infant mortality rates, the concentration of deaths in the Tiedemann household felt excessive. One daughter at 15 could be explained. An elderly mother was expected. But 3 more children in 2 years, all in the same house, all in the same family? Neighbors began to whisper. Perhaps it was something in the house itself: bad air, contaminated water, some flaw in the construction, or perhaps it was something darker: fate, curses, the idea that some places simply attracted misfortune. The whispers grew louder when people noticed what Hannes was doing to the house. He could not stop remodeling it. Even as he buried child after child, Hannes threw himself into changing Franklin Castle. He hired workers to add more windows. He reconfigured interior spaces, moving walls, altering the flow of rooms. He built additions. He tore down what had just been built and built it again differently. The sound of hammers and saws became constant on Franklin Boulevard. From one perspective, this makes psychological sense. Grief does strange things to the mind. Some people cannot sit still. They must work, must do something to avoid the crushing weight of loss. But to the neighbors watching, from across Franklin Boulevard, the constant construction looked obsessive. It looked frantic. The remodeling continued year after year. Every time workers finished one project, he commissioned another. The house was never quite finished, never quite settled. It existed in a state of perpetual transformation, as though Hannes believed that if he could just get the configuration right, the deaths would stop. They did not stop. The house on Franklin Boulevard, the monument to success and ambition, had become something else. But life did persist, fragile and precious. 2 children survived. August and Dora grew past the dangerous years of early childhood. They reached adolescence, then adulthood. They married. They gave Hannes and Louise 6 grandsons, all boys, all healthy, all living long enough to carry the Tiedemann name into the 20th century. There were moments of joy then. Weddings celebrated in the grand rooms, grandchildren running through the halls, holidays where the family gathered, and for a few hours, the weight of loss lifted enough to allow laughter. But the dead were always present. Their absences were carved into the hearts of everyone who remained. And in the house itself, in the walls that Hannes kept changing, and the windows he kept adding, and the rooms he kept rearranging, something had shifted. Franklin Castle was no longer simply a mansion. It was no longer just a symbol of immigrant success. It had become a place marked by death, a place where tragedy had visited so often that it seemed to have taken up permanent residence. The neighbors' whispers would never fully stop. The questions about what happened inside those walls would never be completely answered, and the shadow that fell across the house in those years would never entirely lift. Death had claimed its place in Franklin Castle, and it was not done yet. 1895. Louise Tiedemann, the woman who had stood beside Hannes through decades of success and unfathomable loss, died of liver disease. She was in her 50s, but the number hardly matters. She was too young. They all had been too young. Louise had watched 5 of her children die. She had buried them one by one, had stood at gravesides that should have been generations away. She had managed the household through Hannes's compulsive remodeling. She had raised the 2 children who survived. She had welcomed 6 grandsons into the world and must have prayed each time that they would live longer than their aunts and uncles had. Now she was gone too. Hannes Tiedemann was alone in the house he had built to prove his success. Alone with rooms that had been filled with life and were now filled only with absence. He had buried his mother, he had buried 5 children, and now he had buried his wife, 7 members of his family, all connected to Franklin Castle, all dead. Within 15 years, he lasted in the house for 1 more year, just 1. In 1896, barely 12 months after Louise's death, Hannes sold Franklin Castle to a German family named Mulhauser. He walked away from the mansion he had commissioned. He simply left. The speed of the sale raises questions that can never be fully answered. Why did Hannes leave so quickly? The sympathetic interpretation is straightforward: grief. Perhaps Franklin Castle had simply become unbearable, a beautiful prison where every wall whispered the names of the dead. But there is another interpretation, darker and more unsettling. Perhaps Hannes left because he believed or feared that something was wrong with the house itself. Perhaps the concentration of deaths had convinced him that Franklin Boulevard was cursed ground. We will never know what Hannes truly felt. The historical record does not preserve his private thoughts. What we know is what he did. He sold the house, he remarried, and he retreated to Steinberg, his summer home in Lakewood near the intersection of Lake and Cove Avenues. It was a smaller property, simpler, quieter, a place without the weight of so much death pressing down on the walls. Hannes lived there for 13 more years. By all accounts, they were peaceful years. He remained active in business and charitable work, helping young people pay for college and supporting causes he believed in. He was remembered as a generous man, a kind man, a community benefactor who had never forgotten where he came from. On a day in 1908, Hannes Tiedemann went for a walk in a park. He was 76 years old. While walking, he suffered a stroke and died. It was quick, it was relatively painless, and it was far, far away from Franklin Castle. Cleveland newspapers praised his contributions to the city's growth. His funeral drew crowds of people whose lives he had touched through business, charity, or simple kindness. He was buried beside Louise at Riverside Cemetery, joining the family whose losses had defined the last decades of his life. And Franklin Castle? It passed into the hands of the Mulhauser family, then eventually to others, beginning a long journey through the 20th century that would transform it from private mansion to cultural center, to haunted attraction, to crime scene, to ruin, to restoration project. For 25 years after Hannes sold it, Franklin Castle passed through various private owners. Families moved in, lived their lives, and eventually moved on. The house remained what it had always been on the surface, a grand mansion on a prestigious boulevard, architecturally significant, respectable. Then, in 1921, the German Socialist Society purchased the property. The house that Hannes Tiedemann had built as a private family home became something else entirely, a cultural center. The building was rechristened Eintracht Hall. For the next 47 years, from 1921 to 1968, it served as the home of the German-American League for Culture, an ethnic cultural organization that celebrated German traditions, language, and community in America. In the early years, the group was involved in political causes. Later, it functioned primarily as a German singing club, hosting concerts and social events in the same rooms where the Tiedemann children had once played. The documented history of this era is respectable, even admirable. In December of 1938, shortly after the Munich Pact, members of the German-American League for Culture publicly protested Hitler's aggression. At a time when many German-American organizations were either silent or sympathetic to the Nazi regime, the members who gathered at Franklin Castle spoke out against the violence being inflicted on German citizens and Germany's neighbors alike. But alongside the respectable narrative, darker legends began to grow. During Prohibition, rumors claimed Franklin Castle became a site for illegal liquor production. The house, with its multiple floors and many rooms, allegedly served as cover for a secret distillery. During World War II, even darker whispers suggested the castle became a nest for Nazi spies. No evidence has ever surfaced to support these claims. No police records document raids or arrests. No FBI investigations mention Franklin Castle. The legends persist anyway, fed by the simple fact that the house was large enough, private enough, and owned by a closed community that might have been able to keep secrets. Large Victorian houses often included service corridors, back staircases, and storage spaces designed to keep servants and supplies out of sight. Franklin Castle was no exception. Over decades, as owners came and went, some of these spaces were forgotten or sealed off. During renovations, workers would occasionally discover a door that had been plastered over, a narrow stairway, a room accessible only through a hidden panel. But to people already primed to believe the house was sinister, each hidden space became evidence of something darker. What were these rooms used for? What secrets had been hidden behind walls that were never meant to be opened? By the time the 1960s arrived, Franklin Castle had developed a reputation that went far beyond its documented history. It was no longer just the house where the Tiedemann family had suffered terrible losses. It was now also, in the minds of many, a place with secrets built into its walls, a place that attracted darkness. In 1968, the German-American League for Culture sold the property. Their 47 years of stewardship were over. The building that had served as Eintracht Hall returned to private ownership. What happened next would cement Franklin Castle's reputation as one of the most haunted houses in America. The Romano family arrived at Franklin Castle in the 1960s with a business plan and 6 children. They saw potential, a large, distinctive building in a historically significant neighborhood. They saw a future restaurant where Cleveland's West Side could gather for good food and dramatic surroundings. What they did not see on that first day was the crying girl in white. Their children did. The hauntings began on moving day. Two of the Romano children were exploring the upper floors while their parents directed furniture placement below. The third floor was mostly empty, waiting to be renovated. The children's footsteps echoed in the bare hallways as they ran from room to room. Then they saw her. A girl in a white dress, standing at the end of the hallway. She was crying. Her hands covered her face. Her shoulders shook with sobs that made no sound. The Romano children stopped running. They stared. One of them called out, asking if she was okay, if she needed help. The girl looked up and vanished. The children ran downstairs, shouting for their mother. Mrs. Romano climbed to the third floor, her children insisting she would see the crying girl. But when they reached the hallway, no one was there. The floor was empty, dusty, silent. Mrs. Romano assured her children that they had seen shadows, that old houses played tricks on the eyes. But she felt something in that hallway, a coldness, a pressure in the air, a sensation of being watched. The crying girl would appear again, and again, always on the third floor. Mrs. Romano would eventually come to believe she knew who the girl was, Emma Tiedemann. The hauntings escalated quickly. Phantom organ music would drift through the rooms late at night, loud and clear, as though someone was playing with practiced skill. The family would follow the sound, searching room to room, but they never found a source. Heavy footfalls climbed the staircases when no one was there. Slow, deliberate steps that creaked on the wooden treads, ascending from floor to floor. Sometimes the footsteps walked right past them. Blankets were yanked off beds in the middle of the night, not sliding off naturally, but pulled with force, ripped away while the children slept. They would wake up cold, confused. The sensation of being watched became constant. The feeling was so oppressive that some began to avoid certain parts of the house entirely. In the middle of summer, certain areas of the house would suddenly drop in temperature. The family would walk from a warm hallway into a room that felt like winter. Doors opened and closed on their own. Locked doors were found standing open in the morning. Sometimes they would watch a door slowly swing open while they stood in front of it. But the most terrifying incident happened to Mrs. Romano alone. She woke up one night on her bedroom floor, not in her bed where she had fallen asleep beside her husband. She was screaming. She did not know why she was screaming. And then she heard it. Another scream right beside her. A woman's voice, full of anguish and rage and terror. The screaming stopped when Mrs. Romano's husband turned on the light. But the memory did not fade. Mrs. Romano would later say that she felt the presence beside her for several seconds after the screaming stopped. She felt that something in the house wanted them gone. The family also reported seeing a woman in black. She appeared in windows, always on the upper floors, always standing perfectly still. Neighbors saw her and assumed someone in the Romano family was standing at the window. The Romanos themselves would catch glimpses of her in reflections or from the corner of their eyes. Mrs. Romano came to believe this was Louise Tiedemann, Hannes's wife. The woman in black was still waiting at the windows, still watching Franklin Boulevard, still trapped in the place where she had suffered so much loss. The Romano family tried to continue with their plans. They began renovations for the restaurant. They attempted to ignore the phenomena, to explain them away, but the experiences did not stop. They intensified. Finally, Mrs. Romano called a priest. The priest came to Franklin Castle. He walked through the rooms. He listened to the family's accounts. He blessed the house with holy water and prayer. When he finished, he did not offer comfort. He looked at Mrs. Romano directly and said something she would never forget. "This house is getting the best of you. You need to leave." The priest believed that Franklin Castle was beyond his ability to help. The Romanos lasted until 1974, less than 6 years in a house they had purchased with dreams of business success and family happiness. The restaurant never opened. The renovations were never completed. The Romano family packed their belongings, locked the door behind them, and left Franklin Castle standing empty once again. But the story of their experiences had already begun to spread. The priest had told others about the house that needed more help than he could provide. The Romano children had talked to their friends. Franklin Castle's reputation was no longer built solely on documented deaths from the 1880s. Now it had fresh testimony. A family with no reason to lie, who had simply tried to live in a beautiful old house and been driven out by experiences they could not explain. The castle stood empty in the mid-1970s, waiting, and someone was listening. Someone who saw opportunity where the Romanos had seen only terror. Someone who understood that a haunted house, properly marketed, could be more valuable than any restaurant. In the mid-1970s, a man named Sam Muscatello purchased Franklin Castle. Unlike the Romanos, who had hoped the ghost stories were exaggerated, Muscatello had a very different vision. He wanted to embrace the hauntings, amplify them, turn them into the main attraction. Sam Muscatello understood something fundamental about human nature. People are drawn to fear when they can experience it safely. A haunted house where actual families had fled in terror was far more compelling than any manufactured Halloween attraction. The Romano story was already circulating through Cleveland. The deaths from the 1880s were documented historical fact. All Muscatello had to do was open the doors and let people see for themselves. He invited local media to explore Franklin Castle. Reporters, radio hosts, television crews, anyone with an audience was welcome to spend time in the house to investigate its reputation. The strategy was brilliant. If the journalists found nothing, the mystery would deepen. If they experienced something strange, their credibility would lend weight to the haunting claims. Either way, Franklin Castle would dominate the news. The journalists came, and many reported experiences they could not explain. John Webster, a Cleveland radio host, had perhaps the most dramatic encounter. He was recording inside Franklin Castle when something invisible snatched the tape recorder from his hands and hurled it down a staircase. He stood at the top of the stairs, holding only a microphone, watching his equipment tumble down the steps and shatter at the bottom. Webster was an experienced broadcaster. His reputation depended on credibility. Yet he insisted that what happened at Franklin Castle was real, unexplainable, and genuinely frightening. Other reporters described passing through, cold vapors that seemed to have substance and intention. They heard mysterious sounds, footsteps, whispers, something that might have been crying from behind closed doors. They felt dread, an emotional weight that pressed down on them in certain rooms. Visitors who paid for tours claimed to see the woman in black standing in the tower window, her figure silhouetted against the glass, watching them from above. The tours were successful. People came from across Cleveland and beyond. Muscatello guided them through the rooms, telling stories of the Tiedemann deaths, the Romano hauntings, the hidden passages, and the mysteries that remained unsolved. Franklin Castle became exactly what he had envisioned, a profitable haunted attraction with genuine historical pedigree. And then, in 1975, came the discovery that would cement the house's dark reputation for decades. During renovation work, construction workers found human bones sealed inside a hidden wall panel. Not a single bone, but multiple bones, reportedly including parts of a skeleton. The bones were described as very old, possibly over 100 years old, which would date them to the Tiedemann era. The public reaction was immediate and definitive. This was proof that Hannes Tiedemann had murdered someone, proof that the legends about the hanged niece or the strangled mistress were not legends at all, proof that Franklin Castle's reputation was earned. Newspapers ran sensational headlines. Television stations sent crews. Ghost hunters declared Franklin Castle one of the most significant paranormal sites in America. The bones seemed to answer every question about why the house felt wrong, why so many people reported disturbing experiences, why the Romanos had fled. But suspicion fell almost immediately on Sam Muscatello himself. The timing was too convenient. A haunted house attraction was operating in the building, generating income from fear and mystery. Then, during renovations that Muscatello controlled, bones were suddenly discovered. Bones that had supposedly been there for nearly a century, but had never been found by previous owners or previous renovations. The theory formed quickly. Muscatello had planted the bones. He had purchased human remains and hidden them in the walls himself, then discovered them during renovations, creating exactly the kind of sensational story that would bring more visitors and more money. Was the theory true? No one knows. No forensic testing was done on the bones, or if it was, the results were never made public. The bones themselves seem to have disappeared from the historical record. They were not preserved. They were not donated to a museum. They were not analyzed by anthropologists. The mystery remains unsolved. The truth is buried somewhere between those two possibilities, and more than 40 years later, no definitive answer has emerged. What is certain is that the bone discovery changed Franklin Castle's story permanently. Muscatello's ghost tours continued for a while, but the business model eventually collapsed. The house, with its constant need for expensive maintenance and repairs, became more trouble than it was worth. The property changed hands again and again. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Franklin Castle passed through multiple owners, each staying only a few years before selling and moving on. What is clear is that Franklin Castle had become something larger than its physical structure. It had become a legend, a story told and retold. By the time the 1970s arrived, decades of reported hauntings had transformed the way people thought about Hannes Tiedemann. The narrative had shifted. He was no longer simply a grieving father who had suffered unimaginable losses. He had become, in whispered conversations and growing legends, a possible murderer. If human remains were hidden in the walls, the reasoning went, then perhaps all the deaths connected to Franklin Castle were not tragedies at all. Perhaps they were crimes. The legend of Karen emerged during these years. Depending on which version you heard, she was either Hannes's niece or his illegitimate daughter. She was described as insane or mentally ill, locked away in the tower or hidden in the attic. The story claimed that Hannes eventually hanged her from the rafters, either to silence her or to end her suffering. Her ghost, some said, was the crying girl in white that the Romano children encountered. Then there was Rachel. In some tellings, she was Hannes's mistress. In others, she was a maid. The legend claimed that Hannes strangled her in the tower room during a jealous rage, either because she threatened to expose their affair or because she had betrayed him with another man. Rachel's ghost became the woman in black that so many people reported seeing in the windows. Other whispered crimes accumulated around Hannes's name. Servants who supposedly disappeared without explanation. Business partners who met suspicious ends. Even Emma and Louise's documented deaths were reframed. Were they really natural? Or had Hannes hastened them? The stories reached their peak when a psychic medium stayed at Franklin Castle during the late 1970s or early 80s. She claimed that Hannes Tiedemann visited her dreams night after night. In these visitations, she said, he confessed to multiple murders. The psychic's claims caused controversy, especially among local historians who had worked to get Franklin Castle added to the National Register of Historic Places based on its architectural significance. But the psychic story spread anyway, adding another layer to the growing mythology. The Victorian Gothic architecture itself may have primed people's minds for these dark stories. The legends, compelling as they are, appear to be exactly that, legends. Stories that grew over decades, fed by genuine tragedy, amplified by Gothic architecture, embellished with each retelling, and motivated partly by the economic incentive to make Franklin Castle as frightening as possible for tourists willing to pay for the thrill of fear. But that leaves the question hanging in the air. If the murders never happened, if Hannes was simply a grieving father and not a killer, then why do so many people report experiencing something wrong in the house? Can a house be haunted by tragedy alone? Can grief and loss imprint on walls and floorboards? Or is something else at work? The answer depends on what you're willing to believe. In the early 1980s, Helen Mercida and her husband moved into Franklin Castle. Like the Romanos before them, they arrived with practical plans and hopes for a normal life. Like the Romanos, they would not stay long. The Mercedas reported experiences that went beyond ghostly sightings and phantom sounds. They claimed to be physically attacked by unseen forces. Helen said she was pushed down flights of stairs on multiple occasions, not tripping, not losing her balance, but feeling hands on her back shoving her forward. She suffered overwhelming bouts of depression that seemed to have no source, no trigger, no explanation beyond the house itself. When she left the property, even briefly, the depression lifted. When she returned, it descended again like a weight pressing down on her chest. Items they placed on tables would appear across the room. The sensation of hostile presences became constant, not the melancholy sadness that Mrs. Romano had attributed to Louise Tiedemann's ghost, but something angrier, more aggressive, more determined to drive them out. But the most disturbing phenomena happened to Helen's husband. He began hearing babies crying from inside the walls. Not faint sounds that might be explained by pipes or wind or the house settling. Loud, clear, unmistakable sounds of infants screaming in distress. Multiple babies, crying at once, their voices muffled as though trapped behind plaster and wood. The sounds came from different locations throughout the house. The Mercedes, like the Romanos before them, wondered if someone was playing tricks on them. They set up an experiment. They placed a tape recorder in a room, locked the door from the outside, and left the recorder running for hours. When they played back the tape, they heard babies screaming. They heard children crying, older than infants, young enough that their voices still had the high pitch of early childhood. And beneath those sounds, they heard what they described as a man's muffled voice, yelling into the recorder. Words indistinct, but tone unmistakably angry. The Mercedes eventually had a child of their own. That decision, more than anything else, convinced them they had to leave. Years later, Helen would tell interviewers that she remained personally shaken by the experience. The phenomena at Franklin Castle had not felt like harmless ghost stories or overactive imagination. They had felt dangerous. The story of babies crying in the walls would become one of Franklin Castle's most disturbing legends. And in 2004, during yet another renovation project, construction workers claimed to find more human bones within the walls. Franklin Castle has survived 2 deliberate attempts to burn it down. The first came in 1970, before Sam Muscatello opened his ghost tours, before the bone discoveries, before Franklin Castle's reputation had fully crystallized. The Cleveland police and fire departments responded to a fire at the address on Franklin Boulevard. What they found when they arrived was not an accident. It was a man standing in the house, methodically setting small fires in multiple rooms. The man had no connection to Franklin Castle. He did not live there. He did not work there. He did not know the current owners. He had simply wandered in from the street, found his way inside, and begun lighting fires wherever he could. Curtains, furniture, papers, anything that would burn. When officers questioned him, asking why he would do such a thing, the man's answer was simple and chilling. I had to burn down the castle because it was pure evil. He described feeling compelled, driven by a force he could not resist, as though something outside himself had taken control of his actions and directed him to the house with a mission to burn it to the ground. What makes this incident notable is that it was documented. Police reports exist. Fire department records confirm it. Unlike many of the house's legends, which rely entirely on personal testimony and oral tradition, this event left an official paper trail. The man's mental state was likely compromised. Whether his conviction that the house was evil stemmed from delusion, from something he genuinely perceived, or from cultural knowledge of the house's reputation influencing his disturbed thinking is impossible to determine. The fires were extinguished. The man was presumably taken into custody. The house survived with minimal damage. But 29 years later, Franklin Castle would not be so fortunate. In 1999, less than a year after Mickey Dean sold the property, fire tore through the building once again. But this time, the damage was not minor. This time, the flames consumed entire sections of the structure, leaving behind charred wood, collapsed ceilings, and rooms open to the sky. The investigation determined what many suspected from the beginning: arson. Franklin Castle, which had survived more than a century relatively intact, was suddenly in real danger of total loss. A new owner purchased the property and began spending large sums on repairs. The work progressed through the early 2000s. Walls were rebuilt, structural supports were reinforced, the roof was patched, but the restoration was never completed. 2 economic recessions struck in the first decade of the 21st century, the dot-com crash of 2001 and the financial crisis of 2008. Both hit real estate and discretionary spending hard. Restoration work, expensive under the best circumstances, became impossible to fund. The project stalled. Franklin Castle sat, partially repaired and partially damaged for years. Some rooms looked nearly restored to their original condition. Others remained blackened shells, exposed to weather, slowly deteriorating further. The house existed in a strange liminal state, neither fully destroyed nor fully saved. The castle endured, scarred and incomplete, a physical manifestation of all the interrupted dreams and unfinished stories that had accumulated within its walls for more than a century. In 1985, Franklin Castle found an unlikely savior. His name was Michael DeVinco, though he was better known by his stage name, Mickey Deans, the last husband of Judy Garland, the legendary actress and singer who had died in 1969. DeVinco purchased Franklin Castle and immediately began investing substantial money in restoration. For the first time in decades, the house had an owner who genuinely cared about its architectural integrity, who saw it as a historic structure worth preserving. Over the next decade, DeVinco worked to restore Franklin Castle to its 19th century condition. He repaired damage from years of neglect. He addressed structural issues. He restored period details that had been lost or covered over. The house, under his stewardship, regained some of its original grandeur. What DeVinco experienced while living in Franklin Castle is less well documented than the dramatic hauntings reported by the Romanos or the Mercedes. Perhaps he was more private about any phenomena he encountered. The years of DeVinco's ownership, from 1985 to 1999, represented a period of relative stability for Franklin Castle. The structure was maintained, the systems were updated, the property was protected from vandalism and further decay. In 1999, DeVinco sold the property. The sale marked the end of Franklin Castle's longest period of stable ownership in the modern era. William Crazy, a Cleveland author and investigative historian, spent years researching Franklin Castle for his book, Haunted Franklin Castle. What he discovered contradicted nearly every dark legend that had grown around Hannes Tiedemann. Crazy's research was thorough. He examined cemetery records, death certificates, newspaper archives, business documents, and family histories. He traced the Tiedemann family through multiple sources, cross-referencing dates and causes of death. His conclusions were definitive, and, for believers in the murder legends, disappointing. They were very kind people, Crazy stated. Mr. Tiedemann was a benefactor of the community. He was a generous man. He gave often to various charities. He was not the monster that has been made out in all these stories about the castle. There's just no truth to that. The documented deaths were exactly what the official records claimed. Emma died of diabetes in 1881, a death sentence for a 15-year-old in an era without insulin. The 3 children who died between 1886 and 1888 succumbed to common childhood diseases. Louise died of liver disease in 1895. Rebecca's death was natural. None of the recorded deaths showed any sign of foul play. As for Karen and Rachel, the alleged murder victims whose bones were supposedly hidden in the walls, Crazy found no evidence they ever existed. The legends were fabrications, stories that grew from imagination and suggestion rather than from historical fact. All this makes for a fantastic ghost story, Crazy wrote. And who doesn't love a good ghost story? There's just one problem: hardly any of this is true. Crazy's research also illuminated how legends grow. The process was visible in Franklin Castle's history. A kernel of truth becomes elaborated over decades. Gothic architecture suggests darkness. People entering an already haunted location become suggestible. Each retelling adds details. Economic incentives, ghost tours, book sales, media attention encourage embellishment. And human psychology demands clear villains. The truth Crazy uncovered was both more mundane and more poignant than the legends. Hannes Tiedemann was not a monster. He was a man who worked hard, succeeded in business, gave generously to his community, and suffered losses that would have broken anyone. He built a beautiful house. He watched his family die in it. He left because staying was unbearable. That story was tragic enough without inventing murders that never happened. In 2011, Franklin Castle found new owners, a European couple, one of whom was a tapestry artist. They purchased the property and began the work that others had started and abandoned, restoring the castle to something approaching its original condition. Unlike previous owners who had courted publicity or been driven out by experience, the European couple maintained privacy. They have made substantial progress on restoration, addressing damage from the 1999 fire and decades of incomplete repairs. But they do not give interviews. They do not discuss any phenomena they may or may not have experienced. They do not welcome paranormal investigators or ghost hunters. The house does appear on Cleveland ghost tours, but only from the outside. Tour buses and walking groups stop on Franklin Boulevard, while guides tell the story of the Tiedemann tragedies, the Romano hauntings, the bone discoveries, and the murder legends. Franklin Castle earned its place on the National Register of Historic Places not because of its haunted reputation, but because of its architectural significance. The house represents high Victorian eclectic. Designed at its finest, an example of the grand residential architecture that defined Cleveland's Gilded Age. The work of Cudell and Richardson, the craftsmanship in the stonework, the distinctive round tower, these elements make the building historically important, regardless of whether ghosts walk its hallways. More than 140 years after Hannes Tiedemann commissioned its construction, the building still stands on Franklin Boulevard. It has survived the deaths that marked its early years, the decades as a cultural center, the exploitation as a haunted attraction. The turrets still rise against Cleveland skies. The round tower still commands attention. The rock-faced sandstone still catches light and shadow. Franklin Castle stands today as it has for nearly 150 years, a mirror reflecting how we process tragedy, how we transform grief into legend, and how desperately we seek meaning in senseless loss. The question of Hannes Tiedemann's legacy remains divided. Was he a grieving father who suffered unimaginable loss, burying 5 children, his mother, and his wife within 15 years? Or was he something darker, a monster who murdered his family and hid the evidence behind walls he obsessively rebuilt? The evidence strongly suggests the former. Cemetery records, death certificates, and historical documentation support William Craigs's research. The deaths were tragic but natural, but the legend insists on the latter. Murder is easier to comprehend than random cruelty. Villains provide answers that bad luck cannot. The castle represents something larger than one family's story. It embodies the fragility of the American dream, how success and ambition cannot protect against death, how the grandest monuments can become tombs. It demonstrates how tragedy stains places in the collective imagination, how Gothic architecture primes minds for darkness, and how stories, once started, grow beyond any possibility of control or correction. Yet the castle's survival is itself a testament to 19th century craftsmanship that has withstood fires and neglect, to the determination of owners who restored rather than demolished, to the power of places to endure even when their original purpose has been forgotten. The stones still hold their secrets, refusing to confess or absolve, offering no simple answers. And perhaps that silence, that refusal to provide the clarity we crave, is the truest haunting of all.